I never imagined that Christmas would be the night my own child looked at me and decided I was disposable. One moment, I was helping prepare a family celebration, believing I still belonged. The next, I was standing in the cold, holding a suitcase, realizing that love, in that house, came with conditions. What hurt most was not being told to leave, but understanding how long I had already been erased. I had given decades of patience, sacrifice, and silence, thinking it would protect me. Instead, it taught them exactly how far they could push me before I finally broke. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Collins, and I am 67 years old. I used to believe that by this age life would move gently, like a river that had already found its course. I imagined quiet winters, familiar routines, and a sense of peace earned after decades of steady work. That winter, in my small town in Pennsylvania, I thought I was finally stepping into that season of calm. I had been widowed for more than 10 years. My husband died suddenly while still working, leaving me with grief and a practical reality that did not wait for mourning. I had already spent most of my adult life in financial risk management for large insurance companies, a career built on caution, structure, and foresight. After his death, work became both my refuge and my anchor. I showed up every day, balanced numbers, assessed dangers, and made sure nothing collapsed under my watch. Responsibility was a language I spoke fluently. When I retired, I did so quietly. No party, no speeches. I moved into a modest house I could manage on my own, kept my expenses low, and settled into a routine that felt safe. My mornings were predictable, my evenings orderly. I had enough savings to live without fear, though not with extravagance. I was not lonely in the dramatic sense, but as the years passed, the silence around me grew heavier during the holidays. My only child, my son Ethan, lived in New Jersey with his wife Lauren and their 2 children. We spoke regularly, politely, the way adults do when they care, but no longer share a daily life. I respected the boundaries of his family and rarely imposed myself. I told myself that distance was healthy, that independence was a virtue, even in motherhood. As December approached, the cold arrived early. Snow settled on rooftops, and the night seemed longer than usual. I unpacked my old Christmas decorations, but left them in their boxes. I had planned to spend the holiday quietly, the way I had for years, with a simple meal and a book. I was not unhappy, just subdued, wrapped in the kind of solitude that feels manageable until it does not. A week before Christmas, Ethan called. His voice sounded warm, almost cheerful. He suggested that I come stay with them for a while, said it would be good for the children, good for all of us to be together. He spoke of a full house, shared meals, and the comfort of family during the holidays. The invitation did not feel forced, just reasonable enough to lower my guard. I hesitated. I worried about disrupting their routine, about becoming an inconvenience without meaning to. I had lived on my own for so long that the idea of sharing space again made me uneasy. Still, a part of me wanted to believe that this was what families did, that accepting the invitation was a step toward closeness, not dependence. In the end, I agreed. I told myself it would be temporary. I sold a few pieces of furniture I no longer needed, packed some clothes, photographs, and small reminders of my past. I left most of my life behind, confident I would return soon. As I locked the door to my house on a gray morning, I felt a quiet mix of hope and restraint. I promised myself one thing as I pulled my coat tighter against the cold. I would not be a burden. I would be helpful, considerate, and invisible when necessary. I did not yet understand that this promise, made with the best intentions, was the first step into a winter far colder than the one outside. If you're still watching and already feeling how quietly painful this beginning is, please comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. What's coming next will reveal just how quickly patience can turn into invisibility. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. When I arrived at my son's house in New Jersey, the first thing that struck me was how carefully everything was arranged. The lawn was trimmed despite the cold. The porch lights glowed warmly, and a wreath hung perfectly centered on the door. From the outside, the house looked like the picture of stability and comfort, the kind of place meant for holiday cards and family photographs. I told myself I was lucky to be welcomed into it. Inside, the warmth was immediate, both from the heating and from the decorations. A tall Christmas tree filled the living room, covered in ornaments that clearly belonged to a life I had only seen from a distance. Lauren greeted me with a practiced smile and a quick hug, speaking enthusiastically about how nice it was to finally have the whole family together. Ethan looked pleased but distracted, already half focused on something else, his attention divided between me, the children, and his phone. The grandchildren were polite in the way children are taught to be. They said hello, kept their distance, and returned quickly to their own world. I did not take it personally. I reminded myself that I was entering their routine, not the other way around. Lauren showed me to the guest room, pointing out where I could put my clothes and which bathroom I would be using. Everything was explained efficiently, kindly even, but nothing was asked. There was no question about whether the room was comfortable or if I needed anything adjusted. It was simply where I would be. At the time, I accepted that without thought. The first evening passed quietly. I offered to help with dinner, and Lauren accepted with visible relief. I set the table, watched the children for a few minutes while she finished cooking and cleaned up afterward. Everyone thanked me. It felt normal, even pleasant, the kind of cooperation families shared without keeping score. The next morning, I woke early out of habit. By the time the rest of the house stirred, breakfast was already underway. Lauren mentioned she had a busy day ahead and asked if I could keep an eye on the children for a bit. Her tone was friendly, appreciative. I agreed without hesitation. From there, the pattern began to form. Small requests came easily and often. Could I warm leftovers, fold laundry, pick up a few things from the store? Each task on its own seemed insignificant. Together, they quietly filled my day. No one asked if I had other plans. No one seemed to consider that I might. Within a few days, the language shifted. Instead of being asked, I was informed. The children needed watching. Dinner would be late. Lauren would be back after her errands. Ethan assumed I would handle the gaps. It was not spoken directly, but it was understood, a rule that did not need to be written down. I adjusted myself accordingly. I told myself that this was temporary, that I was helping because I wanted to, not because it was expected. I reminded myself that families work through unspoken arrangements all the time. Still, I noticed how my own needs slowly moved to the edges of the day, then off the page entirely. One afternoon, I offered a suggestion about dinner, nothing more than a passing thought. Lauren nodded, smiled, and proceeded exactly as she had planned. My words landed and vanished without resistance, without acknowledgement. It was a small moment, but it lingered. By the end of the week, I no longer felt like a guest. I also did not feel like family. I was something in between, useful and present, but unseen. I continued to tell myself it was a misunderstanding, that the holiday stress would pass, yet deep down, I understood that the invitation I had accepted came with terms no one had bothered to explain. If you're still here and starting to sense the tension building beneath the surface, comment number 2 below so I know you're following closely. What happens next is the first crack that changes everything. Let's continue to chapter 3. The shift did not happen all at once. It settled in quietly, like dust you only notice after it has already coated the furniture. By the second week in my son's house, the feeling of being a temporary guest had disappeared entirely. No one announced the change. It simply became understood that I was there to fill in wherever something was missing. Lauren no longer asked if I could help. She told me what needed to be done, often while already moving on to the next task. Her tone was not openly unkind, but it carried a sharp efficiency that left no room for discussion. If I moved too slowly or did something differently than she preferred, she would sigh and redo it herself, making a point of how much time had been lost. Once, she remarked that things were harder to manage when people were not used to the pace of modern life. She did not look at me when she said it, but I felt the comment land where it was intended. Ethan saw all of this. He was in the room when his wife corrected me, when she dismissed my suggestions, when she spoke about me as though I were not there. Each time he chose the same response, none at all. He would glance up briefly, then return to whatever was occupying him, as if silence could smooth over discomfort. His refusal to engage hurt more than any direct criticism. It told me clearly where I stood. The children changed too, though I knew they were only following what they observed. They stopped greeting me in the mornings unless prompted. They spoke to me as if I were staff, not family, asking for snacks or rides without courtesy. When I reminded myself that children absorb attitudes quickly, it softened the sting but did not erase it. By then, my days had taken on a rigid structure that did not belong to me. I woke early, prepared breakfast, and managed the flow of the household while Lauren focused on her plans. I cooked dinners, cleaned afterward, and stayed home when the children needed supervision. No one checked whether I had other ideas for my time. No one asked how I felt. One afternoon, while folding laundry, I overheard Lauren speaking on the phone in the next room. She mentioned how difficult it was when older people lost their sense of usefulness and needed to be accommodated. The words were casual, almost careless, but they settled heavily in my chest. She never used my name. She did not have to. I told myself not to overreact. I reminded myself that I had chosen to be there, that families were imperfect, that everyone was under holiday stress. To keep the peace, I worked harder. I stayed quiet. I made myself smaller. I wanted to prove that I was not a burden, that my presence added value rather than strain. Still, the doubt grew. Late at night, lying awake in the guest room, I thought about my house in Pennsylvania. I remembered my routines, my independence, the calm I had taken for granted. I wondered when helping had crossed the line into obligation and how I had failed to notice the moment it happened. The turning point came over something trivial. I had prepared a simple meal one evening, nothing elaborate. Lauren glanced at it and commented that it was not how she usually did things, then proceeded to remake part of it herself. Ethan watched from the doorway and said nothing. No one thanked me. The effort vanished as if it had never existed. In that moment, I understood that I was no longer seen as a mother offering help, but as a convenience that could be adjusted or corrected without consideration. I finished cleaning the kitchen in silence, my hands steady even as something inside me shifted. For the first time since arriving, I admitted the truth to myself. I was not being appreciated. I was being managed, and the realization settled with unsettling clarity that this was not an ending, but the beginning of something far more difficult to face. If you're still watching and realizing how deeply this situation is spiraling, comment number 3 below to stay with me. The next chapter introduces a moment no one sees coming, and it will shift the balance forever. Let's move on to chapter 4. By the time the third week began, I had learned how to move through my son's house without being noticed. I completed tasks quietly, kept my opinions to myself, and avoided unnecessary questions. The less space I took up, the smoother the days seemed to go. I told myself that endurance was a form of grace, that patience would carry me through the holidays. One afternoon, the house was unusually quiet. Lauren had taken the children out, and Ethan was at work. I stood alone in the kitchen, wiping down a counter that was already clean, more out of habit than need. In the stillness, I felt the weight of how far I had drifted from the woman I used to be. I had spent my career identifying risks before they became disasters, yet somehow I had walked blindly into a situation where my own value was being steadily erased. As I rinsed the cloth and set it aside, my phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Then something made me answer. The voice on the other end was professional, calm, and direct. The caller introduced himself as a representative from a national financial firm I had worked with years earlier. He asked if I had a moment to talk, then moved quickly into the reason for the call. The company was facing a serious internal crisis involving senior leadership. A financial scandal had triggered an investigation, and several executives had been suspended. They needed someone they could trust to step in immediately after the holidays. As he spoke, my mind struggled to catch up. I listened, barely breathing, as he explained that my name had come up repeatedly during their internal review. My reputation for integrity, my experience in risk management, and my history of navigating complex situations without compromising ethics had made me an ideal candidate. He offered me the role of interim senior financial advisor with full authority to stabilize their operations. Then he mentioned the compensation, $75,000 per month for a 6-month contract, beginning just after Christmas. For a moment, the kitchen around me seemed unreal. The hum of the refrigerator sounded louder than usual, and the light through the window felt too bright. I thought of my days spent folding laundry and managing other people's schedules, of being spoken over and corrected, of quietly shrinking myself to fit into someone else's life. The contrast was almost dizzying. I asked for time to consider the offer. The caller agreed, reassuring me that they understood the weight of the decision and were confident I would recognize the importance of the role. When the call ended, I remained standing there, phone still in my hand, unsure whether to laugh or sit down. I did not tell anyone about the call. Not Ethan, not Lauren. I knew with unsettling clarity that if they learned of it, everything would change. The sudden kindness, the renewed interest, the rewritten narrative of my place in the family would not come from love, but from calculation. I was not ready to see that. Instead, I carried the knowledge quietly. I went back to my routine, preparing dinner that evening as usual, listening to conversations that did not include me. Yet inside, something had shifted. For the first time since arriving, I felt grounded in a truth no one could take away. That night, lying awake in the guest room, I stared at the ceiling and thought about what the call meant. It was not just an opportunity. It was proof that the woman I had been, the professional I had built over decades, had not disappeared. She had simply been waiting. As Christmas drew closer, I understood that my life was already changing, even if no one else could see it yet. If you're still here and felt that quiet shock settle in, comment number 4 below to let me know. From here on, the story stops being about endurance and starts becoming something much more dangerous. Let's continue. Christmas Eve arrived wrapped in lights and noise. From the moment I woke, The house buzzed with movement and expectation. I rose early, as I had every day since arriving, and began preparing food before anyone asked. By now, no one needed to ask. The rhythm of my role had settled into place, familiar and unchallenged. The living room filled quickly that evening. Coats were piled by the door, glasses clinked, and laughter rose and fell in waves. The tree glowed in the corner, heavy with ornaments that told stories I did not know. I stayed in the kitchen, moving between stove and counter, keeping track of dishes and timing, making sure nothing ran late. It felt strangely like a job I had never applied for and could not leave. No one asked if I wanted to join the guests. No one suggested I sit down. I told myself it did not matter, that I was helping, that this was what I had come for. Still, the longer the night went on, the more invisible I felt. Conversations floated past the doorway, names and memories exchanged without me. I was present, but not included. At one point, a guest wandered into the kitchen, looking around with casual curiosity. He glanced at me and asked lightly whether I was the one helping out for the evening. The question was framed as a joke, the kind meant to be harmless. Lauren laughed. Ethan did not say anything. No one corrected the assumption. The moment passed quickly, swallowed by the noise of the party, but it left something sharp behind. I felt heat rise to my face, followed by a hollow chill. In that brief exchange, my place in the room had been defined for everyone present. I was not introduced as a mother or a grandmother. I was a function. I turned back to what I was doing and kept working. Plates were washed, counters wiped, trash taken out. I moved carefully, deliberately, as though any misstep might draw attention. From the kitchen window, I could see the snow beginning to fall, soft and steady, catching the colored lights strung along the fence. It should have been beautiful. Instead, it felt distant, like something happening in another life. As the evening wore on, the laughter grew louder, then slowly faded as guests began to leave. Coats were retrieved, hugs exchanged. I remained where I was, finishing the last of the cleanup. When the house finally quieted, I stood alone in the kitchen, the hum of appliances filling the space where voices had been. I looked at the reflections in the darkened window, at the lights blurring into small points against the night. For the first time, I allowed myself to ask a question I had been avoiding. What exactly was I to them now? The answer came with unsettling clarity. I was useful. I was convenient. I was not essential. Upstairs, I could hear the muffled sounds of the family settling in, doors closing, footsteps fading. No one came to check on me. No one thanked me for the evening. I finished the last task and turned off the kitchen light, leaving the room exactly as it had been expected to be. In the guest room, I sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded in my lap. My phone rested on the nightstand, silent, holding the knowledge of a life beyond these walls. I thought about the call I had received days earlier, about the version of myself that still existed somewhere in the world. The contrast felt almost unbearable. That night, as Christmas Eve slipped into Christmas Day, I understood something I could no longer deny. This house was warm, decorated, full of people, yet I had never felt colder. And as I lay awake listening to the quiet settle in, I knew that whatever came next, it would not allow me to disappear so easily again. Christmas morning arrived quietly, stripped of the cheer it was supposed to bring. The house felt hollow in the pale light, as if the noise from the night before had been a temporary illusion. I woke early, my body following habits formed over a lifetime, though my mind felt distant and heavy. For a moment, I lay still, listening. There was no laughter, no warmth drifting down the hallway, only the low hum of the heating system and the muted sounds of winter outside. Downstairs, Ethan and Lauren moved through their routine as if nothing unusual had happened. Coffee brewed, cabinets opened and closed, the children's voices floated in and out of the room. No one mentioned the party. No one asked how I was feeling. I stood at the edge of the kitchen, suddenly aware that my presence no longer registered as something worth acknowledging. As I watched the morning unfold, a quiet decision began to take shape. I told myself that leaving for a few days might ease the tension, that distance could soften what had grown sharp. I did not want an argument. I only wanted space to breathe. When I mentioned that I was thinking of returning to my house in Pennsylvania for a short visit, my voice remained calm, measured, the way it had always been in difficult conversations. Lauren reacted first. She looked at me with a mix of surprise and irritation, as though the idea itself was an inconvenience. She spoke about how much the family needed help, how disruptive it would be for me to leave during the holidays. Her words framed my presence not as a choice, but as a responsibility I was expected to fulfill. Ethan did not hesitate. He stood beside his wife, his expression closed, and made it clear where he stood. If I was unhappy, he said, then I did not have to stay. There was no attempt to understand why I felt the way I did, no effort to bridge the growing distance between us. His tone was final, as if the matter had already been settled in his mind. In that moment, something inside me went very still. I realized that everything I had endured, every adjustment I had made to avoid conflict, had led to this point. I was not being asked to stay. I was being reminded that I was tolerated only as long as I served a purpose. The truth, once seen, could not be unseen. I did not argue. I did not explain myself again. I simply nodded and went upstairs. In the guest room, I opened my suitcase and began to pack the few things I had brought with me. Each item felt lighter than it had when I arrived, as if the weight I had been carrying did not belong to them at all. I folded my clothes carefully, the way I always had, grounding myself in small, familiar motions. No one came to the door. No one offered to help. When I carried my suitcase downstairs, the house continued around me, unchanged. I put on my coat, pulled my scarf close, and stepped outside into the cold. Snow crunched softly under my shoes, and my breath formed small clouds in the air. I called a taxi and waited at the curb. As I stood there, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. There were no tears, no dramatic sense of loss. Instead, there was clarity. I understood that I was leaving more than a house. I was leaving a version of myself that had been shrinking to fit someone else's expectations. When the taxi arrived, I placed my suitcase in the trunk and took one last look at the front door. It remained closed. As the car pulled away, the house faded from view, and with it, the life I had tried so hard to maintain. I did not know exactly where I was going next, but I knew with absolute certainty that I would not be coming back. If you're still watching after that breaking point, comment number 6 below so I know you're ready. What comes next is not about collapse, but about consequences that no one expected. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7. The hotel room was small, neutral, and quiet, which was exactly what I needed. After the taxi dropped me off the night before, I checked in without ceremony, signed my name, and accepted a key card from a clerk who did not ask questions. The anonymity felt like a relief. I took the elevator up, rolled my suitcase inside, and closed the door behind me with a final click that echoed longer than it should have. I showered slowly, letting the hot water ease the tightness from my shoulders. The mirror reflected a face that looked tired, but steadier than I expected. When I finished, I unpacked only what I needed, lining my clothes neatly in the small dresser as if order itself could anchor me. Sleep came in fragments, light and restless, but it came without the heaviness I had carried for weeks. Morning arrived pale and cold. From the window, I could see the city moving through the holiday, couples bundled in coats, a train sliding along the tracks below. Christmas was still happening, just not for me. For the first time, that realization did not sting. It simply existed. I made coffee with the small machine by the window and sat on the edge of the bed, letting the events of the past days settle into something solid. There was sadness, of course. Losing the illusion of family closeness was not painless. But beneath it was a clear understanding that what I had left behind was not safety or love. It was a role that demanded silence in exchange for acceptance. I thought about my son and felt a familiar ache, but it was muted now, filtered through clarity. I had done what I could. I had tried to adapt, to help, to make myself smaller so that everyone else could remain comfortable. The result was not harmony, but erasure. Accepting that truth felt like stepping into cold air after a long, stuffy room. Later that morning, I picked up my phone and made a call I had been holding back. When the representative from the financial firm answered, his tone was calm and respectful. I told him that I had considered the offer carefully and that I was ready to accept the position of interim senior financial advisor. There were no grand speeches, no hesitation in my voice. The decision felt settled, firm. The response on the other end was immediate and professional. Details followed, timelines and next steps laid out clearly. There was appreciation in his words, not flattery, but recognition. When the call ended, I set the phone down and took a deep breath. The contrast was impossible to ignore. In one conversation, I had been treated as capable and trusted. In another life, I had been treated as expendable. For the first time in a long while, I placed myself at the center of my own decisions. Leaving had not been a failure. It had been an act of preservation. I could feel the shift inside me, subtle but profound, like a door quietly closing on a room I no longer needed to enter. I began to think practically. I would need a place to live, something temporary at first, then more permanent. I would need to retrieve my belongings from Pennsylvania when the weather allowed. These thoughts did not overwhelm me. They organized themselves into steps, manageable and clear. I did not call Ethan. I did not send a message or wait for one. The silence was not meant to punish. It was a boundary, one I had never allowed myself before. I understood that reaching out now would only reopen a wound that needed time to close. As the morning light shifted across the room, I stood by the window and watched the city move forward. People hurried past, carrying gifts and expectations. Somewhere inside that movement, my own life was continuing, reshaped but intact. The day after everything changed did not feel like an ending. It felt like the first honest beginning I had allowed myself in years. The weeks after Christmas passed more quickly than I expected. By the time January settled in, I had begun to develop a rhythm that belonged entirely to me. My days were structured again, not around other people's needs, but around work that demanded my attention and respected my judgment. I moved from the temporary quiet of the hotel into meeting rooms and conference calls, where decisions mattered and words carried weight. Stepping into my new role felt strangely familiar, as if I had never truly left that world. The pace was demanding, the problems complex, but clarity replaced confusion. I was asked for my opinion, listened to carefully, and trusted to act. The contrast with my recent life was impossible to ignore. During the day, I was decisive and capable. At night, I returned to my room alone, but the solitude no longer felt like exile. It felt chosen. It did not take long before signs from my old life began to surface. Missed calls appeared on my phone, followed by short messages from Ethan. They were cautious and vague, asking how I was doing, saying he hoped I was well. I read them without urgency and set the phone aside. I was not angry. I simply was not ready to re-enter a conversation that had always required me to shrink. News travels quietly, even when no one intends it to. Through a mutual acquaintance, I learned that Ethan's company had undergone sudden restructuring. His position had been eliminated, leaving him without work at the start of the year. Lauren's financial troubles followed closely behind, credit card balances spiraling under pressure. Soon after, I heard that the bank had begun contacting them about missed payments. The house that had once felt so firmly beyond my reach was no longer secure. The tone of the messages shifted. Ethan called more often. When he spoke, his voice carried a softness I had not heard in years. He mentioned family, spoke about misunderstandings, hinted at regret without naming it. There were no direct requests, no outright admissions, but the implication was clear. Circumstances had changed, and suddenly my absence mattered. I listened carefully, not to his words, but to what lay beneath them. I did not hear accountability. I heard fear. The difference was subtle, but unmistakable. It was not remorse that reached for me, but necessity. Recognizing that truth brought neither satisfaction nor bitterness. It brought clarity. I chose not to respond right away. My silence was not meant as punishment. It was a boundary, one I was learning to maintain without apology. For years, I had equated love with availability, believing that being present at any cost was the price of belonging. Now I understood that constant access had only taught others to take me for granted. As I moved through my days, I noticed the change within myself. I no longer waited for validation from my son or searched his voice for signs of approval. My sense of worth no longer rose and fell with his attention. It was rooted elsewhere now, in competence, in independence, in the quiet certainty that I was whole on my own. I knew we would eventually have to face each other. Avoidance could not replace resolution forever. But when that moment came, it would not be on the old terms. I would not arrive as someone seeking forgiveness or permission. I would arrive as myself, steady and clear, prepared to speak without surrendering ground. For the first time, I understood that silence was not emptiness. It was space. And in that space, I had finally found my footing. If you're still here and sensing the shift in power, comment number 8 below to stay with me. The final chapters will reveal who truly changed and who was never ready for the truth. Let's move toward the ending. Ethan asked to meet a few days later, suggesting a small cafe not far from where he lived. I agreed after some thought, choosing a time when I knew I would not feel rushed. When I arrived, the place was quiet, the late afternoon light slanting across empty tables. I ordered a coffee and sat near the window, taking in the calm before he arrived. He walked in a few minutes late. The difference between us was immediate and unspoken. I felt composed, grounded in the life I had rebuilt step by step. Ethan looked worn, his posture tight, his eyes shadowed by strain. We exchanged brief greetings and sat down. There was no embrace, no easy warmth to fall back on. He spoke first, filling the silence with explanations about work, stress, and how difficult the past weeks had been. He mentioned the children, the house, the pressure of keeping everything together. I listened without interruption. I had learned that silence could be more revealing than argument. What I heard was not an apology, but a careful arrangement of circumstances meant to soften what he was about to ask. Eventually, he asked how I was doing. I answered simply, telling him that I was working again. His expression shifted slightly, curiosity breaking through the tension. I explained that I had accepted a temporary senior advisory role with a national financial firm, stepping in to help stabilize operations after a crisis. I kept my tone neutral, factual, as though discussing the weather. When I mentioned my compensation, I did so without emphasis. $75,000 per month. The words landed heavily between us. Ethan stared at me, disbelief written plainly across his face. I could see him recalculating, measuring the distance between the woman he thought he knew and the one sitting across from him. In that moment, I noticed the change in his gaze. It was not pride or relief. It was recognition mixed with unease. For years, he had seen me as someone to be managed, someone whose needs were secondary. Now, the balance had shifted, and he did not know where to place himself. I did not dwell on the past. I did not list grievances or revisit every slight. There was no need. I told him calmly that I was not looking to move back or to take on responsibilities that left me diminished. I explained that I needed stability, respect, and space to live on my own terms. He hinted at needing help, at how difficult things had become. I heard the request beneath his words and answered it by setting a boundary. I told him that I cared about him, but I would not return to a situation where my presence depended on usefulness rather than regard. We finished our drinks and cements. When we stood to leave, there was no argument, no dramatic farewell, just a quiet understanding that something fundamental had changed. I walked out of the cafe into the cool air, feeling neither triumphant nor bitter. For the first time, I did not feel the need to explain myself further. I had spoken the truth plainly, and that was enough. When I returned to my place that evening, the quiet no longer felt temporary. It felt earned. I set my keys on the table, poured a glass of water, and stood for a moment by the window, watching the city settle into night. The light reflected softly off the glass, and for the first time in a long while, I did not feel the need to brace myself against anything. I thought about the weeks that had led me here. Before Christmas, I had been measuring my worth by how little space I took up. I had mistaken endurance for love and silence for peace. Now, standing in a room that belonged entirely to me, I could see the difference clearly. Money had changed my circumstances, yes, but it had not changed my value. That had always been there. What changed was my willingness to protect it. I felt no guilt about the choices I had made. Refusing to return to a place where I was diminished did not mean I loved my son less. It meant I loved myself enough to stop accepting harm as a condition of belonging. There is a difference between generosity and self-erasure, and I had crossed that line too many times before learning where it truly lay. Family, I realized, could not be defined by blood alone. It had to be grounded in respect and emotional safety. Where those were absent, obligation became a quiet form of damage. I did not need to close my heart to understand that truth. I only needed to set boundaries strong enough to hold. My work gave me stability and freedom, but the deeper success came from reclaiming my voice. I could choose how to live, where to stand, and when to say no without apology. Self-respect was not a luxury reserved for the young or the powerful. It was a right, one I had finally decided to exercise. I thought gently of the woman I had been before all of this began, the one who tried to smooth every conflict, who believed that patience would eventually be rewarded. I felt compassion for her, not judgment. She had done the best she could with what she understood at the time. Learning did not make her weak. It made her wiser. I did not plan too far ahead that night. I did not need to. It was enough to know that the steps I would take next would be my own, chosen freely and without fear. As I turned off the lights and prepared for sleep, I felt something settle into place. Freedom, I had learned, was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet. It was steady. And it was finally mine. Some stories do not end with triumph or reconciliation, but with clarity. They remind us that dignity is not granted by others. It is claimed from within. Time, age, and circumstance do not erase a person's worth, even when the world grows quiet around them. True strength often appears not in confrontation, but in the calm decision to walk away from what diminishes us. Boundaries are not walls of bitterness, they are acts of self-respect. And freedom, in its truest form, is the courage to choose oneself without anger, without apology, and without fear. When we stop seeking validation from those who cannot give it, we finally make room for a life that is honest, grounded, and our own. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it resonated with you, we would love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments. Do not forget to like, follow, and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss future stories that speak to resilience, growth, and self-worth.